Thank you very much, Mr. Rudd. That was an extremely enlightening speech, and I've taken 3 pages of notes here so we can ensure that the discussion is focused and accurate. Before we kick off the questions, can I just remind everyone, if you're going to ask a question from the floor, could you please tell us your name and your organisation and keep the question short? And if I don't stop you, Mr. Rudd will. Can I also remind you that we can use the pigeonhole technology, and when I stood up there were not yet any questions through. So with that, please, I think the first question is down here in the front row.
Okay, thank you. Alan Clear from Insight Partners. If you put me on the spot, I would like to know the top 3 things that you would do. When you talked about your policy, you had 3 things. My comment about the 10 was it's a long laundry list. If we're going to do things, we need to concentrate on the things that have maximum impact. So out of your list of 10, what are the top 3?
The top 3 were the top 3 out of the 10. That's why I started with 1, went on to 2, and went on to 3. I finished at 10. The first was this. We need a carbon price. 2, if we can't get a carbon price, achieve it by regulation. And that's through regulatory standards, whether it's on appliances or motor vehicles or the rest of the transport sector or in the stationary energy sector, to achieve the same outcome by different, and I would say, less flexible means. Why were we committed to carbon pricing? It's a flexible means. It's a market-based mechanism where choices are made across the economy. But if this mob in the current parliament are not going to permit that approach because they're anti-market, and instead they'd prefer the dead hand of socialism to do it through a bunch of regulations, and other countries around the world are doing this, then that's the logical corollary to the absence of a carbon price. You either achieve a GHG reduction on the basis of a carbon price which is universal across the economy, which then changes market behaviour accordingly as we price the externality, if you like, of the impact on the economy of growing greenhouse gas emissions and make people pay for it through their individual corporate decisions. But if the political process is so dominated by the climate denialists of the Liberal Party and the National Party, then you go to the alternative approach, which is then to regulate the economy to achieve the same outcome. That was proposal number 2. And proposal number 3 is, given the success that we've achieved through the mandatory renewable energy target legislated by my government, which they have not been able to repeal despite multiple attempts, and we now have this big mass of renewable energy providers in this country, then take that and leverage that into new areas of research, innovation, venture capital support, so that we turn this into a major additional new generator of employment across the country, as well as assisting in further bringing down our total greenhouse gas emissions. If you're interested in the rest of the 10, the text of the remarks, which I summarised in my speech before, we'll hand to CEDA and they'll put it up online. But these are not, as you said, a laundry list. That's quite wrong. In fact, it's offensive. These are considered points about actual policy action which can be taken, which has a material effect, which is why when I enumerated the 3 earlier actions by my government, I indicated the effect they had in actual greenhouse gas emissions. These are not just things that float into the air. These are material decisions which have an effect on the real economy, which is measurable.
Thank you very much. We have a question just here in the middle. Thank you.
Lisa Magnani, Macquarie University. I'm interested in asking you to expand your number 9, which speaks of the transition for workers and communities from an old-fashioned economy, carbon-based, to a new economy, the way you envisioned in your great speech and presentation. And of course, we understand that this is highly political, as well as high priority in terms of economic terms.
If you look at economic history, great transformations in energy have always had a huge effect on economies and societies. There's a recent evocative study of the arrival of the combustion engine on the land transport system of New York. In 1900, there was something like 1.25 million horses in New York. The place stunk to high heaven as well, by the way, through horse manure. By 1915, you were down to about a couple of thousand. Now, the economic adjustment associated with that in terms of people who looked after horses, quite apart from the horses themselves, was huge. But the internal combustion engine brought about a massive new set of employment opportunities through people who made them, people who serviced them, and the rest. And so it is with the transition, if you were, through this new energy revolution, post the internal combustion engine fueled by carbon, into the renewable energy futures that I described in my remarks. The actual transition, however, in particular communities, is what we as a social democratic government take particular care in, which is not to simply throw people under the bus and say, go and find a new job, when you may not be able to do so in that locality or near localities. And that's why you have to be able to have a flexible fund available, ideally jointly between industry and government, but deployed locally and by authorities, local authorities who matter and have accountability to those communities to build the adjustment mechanisms. Now, I think, Steve, you're from Wollongong, Steve Martin, we've seen this in the transformation of Wollongong over the years. We've seen it in Newcastle over the years. When BHP turned around and said it was the end of manufacturing steel in Newcastle, there was a view that was the end of Newcastle. Well, the renewal of the Newcastle economy is a phenomenon to behold. And it's been done through successive levels of also industry policy support and intervention by various levels of government. That's what I'm talking about here. It's doable. And it's the way to deal with both the social impact, but frankly, the manageability of the politics of such a transition as well, rather than just saying, screw you, industry changes come, goodbye.
That's a very nice segue, Mr. Rudd, to a question that we've just had. That's a great vision for how we respond from a structural adjustment perspective and create new jobs and actually reach into that fiscal policy bucket to do something different. The question here is, how do you do that? What needs to happen to overcome politics and ideology so we can have a bipartisan commitment to climate change action?
It sounds like a question I got this morning on Melbourne ABC radio from Virginia Trioli. And my response to Virginia was as follows. Virginia, that sounds like a perfectly civilised dinner time conversation. But can I put it to you in pretty blunt terms? The legislative actions to bring about change to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in this country have been brought about by Labor governments and have been fought in the trenches by the Conservatives. Every step of the way, every election along the way, usually with the great national echo chamber, otherwise called the Murdoch newspapers. Now, so when we therefore talk about bipartisanship, a very polite term, we can all have an Edwardian tea party and wish that it would be better. We can have a seminar afterwards and hope that reasonableness prevails so that no one gets upset. This is a hardline political fight between those of us on the centre-left who kind of got the project about 15 years ago, finally understood the science and decided this is big, we've got to do something about it. And we have fought every election on this question since then and been opposed by the Conservatives. I would have thought that after the great Australian inferno over the summer, that even Scotty from marketing would get the message that this is no longer a sustainable proposition, that something fundamental is hitting the economy amidships. When I run into families who evacuated their kids from schools here and who were staying over the summer after the end of the term because of fires in and around Sydney, that begins to have a reputational effect. Tourism numbers affected by fires, the real economy being affected by fires, quite apart from the property losses and the destruction. So, the essential question is this: what does the Liberal Party, aided by their progressive comrades in the National Party, now do on this question? And I do not know the answer to that. Some of you may be members of the Liberal Party. I don't know. But I would think in terms of political survival that there must be a force for change. The breakout in the last week by the Trent Zimmermans of this world, by the Melbourne equivalents, by those who have inner city seats in Brisbane for the Liberal Party, about the need for a redirection of course on climate, is the beginning of the indication of some change. And so too is the fight back within the Conservative parties as well, and again reinforced by the echo chamber of Murdoch, which has been a consistent campaigner against climate change action for about the last 10 to 15 years. So if that happens, then we're starting to cook with gas, so to speak. If it doesn't happen, then we're going to have another ugly, knock 'em down, drag 'em out fight at the next election on a future course of action on domestic carbon mitigation and appropriate parallel international action. And I just wish the country would get over it. We'd be 10 years into carbon transition by now had the Green Party not allied with the Liberals to kill carbon pricing through the ETS back in 2009. We'd be 10 years down the track. We wouldn't have been having this discussion. Everyone would just be kind of adjusting accordingly. Why did we do it back then? Because I knew when I announced that policy and went down to explain it in the guts of an open-cut coal mine in Queensland at the time, that it would hurt people. But it was far better we had a decade plus to begin to transition out of this, rather than an investment decision in New York where they deny finance to a project, killing these things stone dead. What will be the adjustment then?
Thank you very much, Mr. Rudd. This is beginning to feel like question time. So those of you who have Dixes, if you could hold them. I have two questions down here in the front. Meriden, over there on the right, thank you. Meriden Varrell, KPMG.
Thank you. I'm Meriden Varrell from KPMG. Hi. Thank you very much, Mr. Rudd, for that very insightful speech. You concentrated on climate change, but you did mention at the outset there were a couple of other very important international contextual issues that impacted Australia's ability to economically develop. And I wondered if you could ever so quickly talk to us a little bit about that divide between China and the US and also that tech revolution and the combination of those two things as well and how that might impact Australia's development. Thank you.
Meriden, sorry, not surprisingly, I had that question. Can I just check before we move to US-China, Mr. Rudd, if you don't mind, if we could take any other climate change relevant questions and then segue across, would that be all right? Steve, you had a question? Was it climate change related? And Terry, thank you. Just to...
Prime Minister, how is it that we can convince
Speaker.
the election... how is it that we can convince the electorate of these issues as well? If the 2019 election was supposed to be a climate change election, it didn't turn out that way for the progressive side of politics who were arguing for the change.
Good, okay. Are there any other climate questions? We could take them in a lump.
And one from Mr. Moran in the front. So for those of you who didn't hear, Mr. Martin's question was, if the last election was meant to be a climate change election, why were voters not convinced? And then Terry.
I think the new president of the European Commission has speculated publicly about using a new style equivalent of tariffs at the border to penalise imports from countries that are not addressing climate change. And as President Trump is now using tariffs as a bolster to negotiations with other countries like China, do you think this particular part of what could be done will start to gain more currency?
Thank you. Just to respond to both Steve's and Terry's questions, which go to how do you prosecute effectively this argument and do new developments in terms of European pricing policy or taxing policy, make that any easier. I think my response would be along these lines. More than a decade ago, I advanced a series of arguments about the cost of action and the cost of inaction on climate change. I would have given 1,000 speeches on this subject in various parts of the country. Back then, a lot of folk thought that the cost of inaction was an abstraction. Now it's concrete. It's not just the fires, that's part of it. It's not just other extreme weather events, that's part of it. it's not just now the changing cost and availability of capital for such projects. And you've already seen the decision by certain international sovereign funds to divest from carbon-heavy investments in this country. That's the very beginning of the breaking of the dam on this, to which the decision by BlackRock, the world's largest investment house, is seminal and agreed between the management of BlackRock and the major banks of the world before it was made public. And then you go to what Terry's just referred to, which is what I did warn about a decade ago, which is carbon tariffs. I recently had discussions with unnamed people from the European Commission. This is on the drawing board, big time. And so therefore, carbon tariffs against non-compliant countries like ours are no longer an abstraction. They are moving to reality. So Steve, where policy meets politics is the argument that I advanced way back then about the cost of inaction now becomes real in terms of job losses here. And that, I think, is a missing element in our, as it were, tangible argument up until now, because the tangible evidence wasn't as manifest, hasn't been as manifest as it is now.
Thank you. And I realise that we're sitting between you and lunch, but I think we would all really appreciate...
Why don't they just serve lunch? I'm perfectly happy.
Great.
I'm racking off at 1 o'clock because I've got to go to Canberra of all places. So you got 10 minutes of this or 10 minutes of eating, whatever you'd like.
Yeah, they keep holding up signs for me at the back. So, Melinda, with due apology, I'd like to go back to Merredin's question, and I think, given your expertise in the US-China relationship and your perspectives on the global environment in which Australia is trying to prosecute its future interests, I think we'd be very interested in your views on the US-China dynamic. And I think, Merredin, you particularly focused on what are the implications there for the digital divide and for Australia?
Thank you for those questions. The Asia Policy Institute, which I head in New York, we deal with these three big questions. And they're not just global questions, they're also Asia-specific questions. US-China, climate, tech, and they all interconnect. On US-China, the truth is, since the end of 2017, in a seminal statement by the United States government, formally redefining China as a strategic competitor and no longer pursuing a policy of strategic engagement with Beijing, the game has shifted. The trade war is but one manifestation of that, as is the current temporary trade ceasefire that we've seen through the Phase 1 agreement, the signing ceremony of which I participated in as one of the observers a few weeks ago in Washington. Phase 2 trade agreement, very difficult, because it goes to intractable questions concerning the future of Chinese state subsidy for their firms in the global marketplace, which goes to the absolute essence of the future competitiveness of American international firms, including in areas like 5G, where it's Huawei versus an Ericsson Nokia alternative, where Huawei does receive significant state subsidy in one form or another around the world, leaving aside all the national security arguments. So the Chinese response to this change in strategy and posture by the United States has been to wait and see. But in reported remarks from Xi Jinping in the middle of last year at a Politburo meeting, he said, we are now looking at a period of sustained strategic provocation from America for the next 30 years, through until mid-century. So whether we like it or not in this country, or whether any other country in our wider region likes it or not, the strategic binaries between these two giants in the global economic living room and the global national security living room have become clear. So the implications for all of us as third countries and third economies is how to manage the binary tension. I'll just say one thing about that. We should, as Australians, be very careful about what I describe as indiscriminate, loose public language, which the current government does from time to time in its management of the China relationship. of itself, the structural tensions we have with China are sufficient to make this a difficult task. Whether I was the Prime Minister today, whether Mr Morrison's the Prime Minister, any Prime Minister would find managing this relationship difficult. That's just the truth of it. But you add huge new degrees of difficulty when members of the government routinely just shoot off their mouths in forms of public abuse against China, which simply add further lead to the saddlebags. It's far better that we are prosecuting an Australian national strategy towards China, which is deeply mindful of our interests, deeply mindful of our values, and we're prosecuting this operationally rather than a declaratory statement through the pages of The Australian every Tuesday morning, because that simply makes matters unnecessarily worse. And every other country in the region experiences the same. Japan, for example, which has historically a much more problematic relationship with China than we do, in the last 2 years has become much closer to China, notwithstanding the great strategic tensions between the two countries and the fact that they have contested territorial space in the East China Sea. But nonetheless, they are managing to prosecute a relationship on 5G, on trade, on investment, on tech, and on foreign policy, which keeps the dynamics of the relationship within manageable bounds. That has not been the case here. In fact, India has prosecuted a more stable relationship with China in the last several years than we have. So therefore, I'm not saying this is easy. It's really hard because of the structural reasons I referred to at the outset, involving changes in strategic posture. But we are simply compounding unnecessarily the degree of difficulty to the disadvantage of this country. One final random thought on tech is just this. Xi Jinping has made a statement in April of 17 which said, "He who commands artificial intelligence and the industries which support it, from semiconductors through to supercomputing, through the particular applications in artificial intelligence, will command the 21st century economy." China's national R&D effort, China's industry policy effort, is in support of China achieving dominance in each of the 10 major sectors of 21st century tech. Now, the United States itself has got that message and is acting in its own way. What I fear for countries like ourselves is that we are becoming, as it were, kind of trailing in the dust in these stakes. There are critical areas of artificial intelligence where this country, at a level of research, is in fact world class. But I go to the question of the extent to which our venture capital industry will apply its creativity and its cash to turning these into huge Australian AI brands for the future. That's where the generator of the next tranche of global growth comes from. And at present, we're not even the caboose at the end of the train. That's the problem. Okay, enough said.
But very powerfully said. And
I'll
I think
be
we're
very fast.
absolute last one. And Ming Long, I know you'll be fast.
I would just say the BlackRock announcement, check it out, because it, as I understand it, only applies to active funds. A passive fund market is a huge component of the market, and that has not shifted. So we need an index without fossil fuels. My question to you was, what's your view of Australia's approach to the Asian diaspora in this country in context of managing the Chinese relationship? And is there a country around the world you think is doing it best?
One of the things which has saddened me most in the last 6 weeks or so is watching the tragedy unfold in China with coronavirus, which is a deeply human tragedy. Put yourself in the minds of being in a family today in Wuhan, a city of 15 million people, China's traditional industrial heartland, and just dealing with the day's anxieties. This is a human story. People in Wuhan didn't cause this virus. Bad regulation of a particular seafood market is probably the cause. Yet the terror that people are living through is palpable, it's physical, it's personal. What I've found disappointing around the world and alarming is the simple lack of human compassion in political communications from governments around the world understanding the human dimensions of this. It's kind of a reason why I jump into social media through Chinese Weibo on a regular basis. Chinese Weibo is like Twitter, because I speak Chinese and I write Chinese. Just sending out simple messages like, we're with you, because people feel very alone. I asked my office the other day to check what statements Prime Minister Morrison had made of solidarity with the Chinese people since this whole thing erupted. He thanked the Chinese for helping get our folks out of Wuhan, but I stand to be correct on this, I just haven't seen an expression of basic humanity to a frightening pestilence. Across the world, there has been, unfortunately, a similar indifference on the part of many Western countries towards China's condition in these circumstances. However, I've noticed very carefully the Chinese government from time to time has expressed their genuine thanks to the expressions of solidarity from Japan towards their condition. Now, if any two countries in the world have reasons to hate each other, it's China and Japan, given, let's call it, a colourful history, going back at least 500 years to Hideyoshi-san. But you know something? In moments of crisis, think about your own lives. When you feel really alone, you do look around to see if you have any friends. I've got to say, international politics ain't much different to that. So people look for friends, and I think we could be doing a lot better on that, particularly when so many, as in your previous session you indicated, so many Chinese families entrust their kids to us to attend our schools and universities, hundreds of thousands of them over the years. More of them come here to study than any other country in the world apart from the United States. So I would think it's either just basic morality or enlightened self-interest which would cause us to be more humane, more sensitive, more engaging and understanding of what is a human tragedy. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.